The land didn't forgive. That was the first and last lesson the high plains taught a man. It was etched into the weathered face of Elias Scott, carved by the same relentless wind that stripped the paint from his clapboard house and worried the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwood by the creek. His ranch, a lonely outpost near the shifting border of Colorado and New Mexico, was a testament to grit, a place of stone and sky that offered no comfort, only the stark reality of survival. Elias moved with the careful, deliberate gait of a man who knew pain as an old companion. A piece of shrapnel from Shiloh had left his left leg permanently stiff, a daily reminder of the roar of cannons and the screams of boys who had died with their mothers' names on their lips. His right hand, too, was a map of past violence. The fingers curled slightly inward, refusing to fully straighten since the day a bayonet had sliced through the tendons. But the wounds a man could see were the least of his burdens. The true ghosts resided behind his pale blue eyes, in the silent spaces between his thoughts. They were the ghosts of the war, of the Union blue he had worn with pride and the things he had done in its name. They whispered to him in the howl of the winter wind and stared back at him from the bottom of a whiskey glass. He was a solitary man, not by choice, but by a slow, creeping resignation. The war had taken his youth, and the peace that followed had taken his purpose. He had returned not to a hero's welcome, but to a world that had moved on, leaving men like him stranded on the shores of their own memories. He worked his land with a grim determination, raising cattle that were as tough and lean as he was. The days were long, filled with the familiar ache of mending fences, branding calves, and staring out at a horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. The nights were longer. The final push into this self-imposed exile had come not from the war, but from its quiet, ugly aftermath. His younger brother, Samuel, had survived the fighting without a scratch, only to be felled by a sickness he'd bought in a dusty, rose-scented room in a Denver saloon. Elias had watched him waste away, the vibrant, laughing boy he'd known reduced to a feverish, coughing wraith. The shame in Samuel's eyes had been worse than the fever. He had died not with the honor of a soldier, but with the quiet disgrace of a man who had sought comfort in the wrong place. On the day he buried Samuel under the lone cottonwood, Elias made a vow. He stood over the fresh mound of earth, the shovel still heavy in his hands, and spoke to the wind. "No more," he'd whispered, his voice raw. "No more of this life, no more filth, no more shame." In that moment, a desperate, practical idea took root in his mind. He needed a wife, not for love. He suspected that part of him had died on a battlefield in Tennessee, but for order, for decency. A wife was a bulwark against the chaos that had claimed his brother and threatened to consume him. A family was a respectable thing, a clean thing. It was a life Samuel should have had. With a family, he would be a rancher, a husband, a father. He would be a man with a place in the world again, not just a ghost haunted by the past. He wasn't a man for courting. He didn't have the words or the charm. So he did what a practical man did. He took a page from a mail-order gazette, the same one he used to order seed and fence wire from, and penned a letter. His handwriting was stiff and awkward, the words chosen with the same economy he applied to everything else. "To whom it may concern, I am a man of 34 years, a veteran of the war. I own a plot of land, 300 acres, with a house and a running creek. I am in good health, save for old injuries that do not impede my work. I do not drink to excess. I am seeking a wife of good character, one who is not afraid of hard work and a quiet life. I can offer a home, protection, and a respectable name. I will provide the train fare to Trinidad, Colorado. Sincerely, Elias Scott." He posted it without rereading it, feeling a strange mix of shame and hope. It was a transaction like buying a new bull for his herd. He was offering property and stability in exchange for companionship and a clean slate. He expected little and was prepared for even less. Hundreds of miles east, in the damp, crowded outskirts of St. Louis, the air tasted of coal smoke and river mud. It was a world away from Elias's stark plains, a world of tenement houses and narrow, dirty streets where hope was a currency scarcer than gold. In a small, third-floor room that was always too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer, two sisters read Elias's letter by the fading light of a grimy window. Mary, the younger at 19, held the letter in her delicate hands. Her fingers, though red from lye soap and endless mending, seemed too fragile for the rough paper. She was a slip of a girl, with corn silk hair and eyes the color of a summer sky, eyes that still held a flicker of innocent dreams despite the poverty that had been the only reality she'd ever known. To her, Elias's letter was not a business proposal. It was a key to a door that led away from the stench of the tannery, the gnawing hunger, and the leering eyes of men on the street. "He has 300 acres, Helena," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "And a house, a whole house." Helena, older by 5 years, stood behind her, her arms crossed over her chest. She was built of stronger stuff than Mary. Where Mary was a willow, Helena was an oak. Her hair was a darker blonde, her eyes a stormy gray that missed nothing. Her face was beautiful, but it was a hard-won beauty, etched with a premature wisdom that came from seeing the world for what it was, not what one wished it to be. She looked at the letter not as a key, but as a potential trap. "He's a stranger, Mary," she said, her voice low and steady. "A man who has to buy a wife from a newspaper." "He's a rancher," Mary countered, her gaze still fixed on the words. "He's offering a new life, a decent life." The word decent hung in the air between them. It was a word Helena understood all too well. For years, she had been the one to stand between Mary and the indecency of the world. After their parents succumbed to influenza, it was Helena who had scrubbed floors, taken in washing, and when that wasn't enough, she had done other things. In the evenings, she had walked down streets where lanterns cast a red glow, and she had spent time in rooms where men paid for smiles and a moment of warmth. She had traded pieces of herself, coin by coin, to keep food on their small table and to ensure Mary's innocence remained intact. Mary knew they were poor, but she never knew the true cost of their survival. Helena had built a wall around her sister with her own body and soul. So when Mary, in her sweet, hopeful script, penned a reply to Elias Scott, accepting his proposal and painting a picture of a diligent, home-making girl, Helena did not try to stop her. She saw the desperation in her sister's eyes, the yearning for a life that didn't involve the constant, grinding fear of tomorrow. But as Mary sealed the envelope, Helena made a decision. "I'm going with you," she declared. Mary's face fell. "Helena, he asked for a wife. He won't want—" "I don't care what he wants," Helena cut in, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I am not sending you halfway across the country alone to a man we know nothing about. I will see for myself if this Mr. Scott is the respectable man he claims to be. I will work for my keep. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend, but I am not leaving your side." And so it was settled. 2 train tickets were purchased with the money Elias sent, and the sisters packed their few belongings into a single, battered trunk. Mary packed her dreams of a new life. Helena packed her distrust, a small, sharp knife, and the grim resolve that had kept them alive for so long. The journey west was a relentless assault on the senses. The train, a snorting iron beast, pulled them from the familiar grayness of the city into a world of impossible scale. The clatter of the wheels on the track was a constant, hypnotic rhythm, a drumbeat marking their passage into the unknown. Soot from the engine dusted every surface, and the carriage was a cramped, swaying world of its own, filled with the smells of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and the nervous sweat of people gambling their futures on a destination they had only ever seen in their minds. Mary spent most of the journey pressed against the window, her expression shifting from wonder to apprehension and back again. The lush green hills of Missouri slowly gave way to the flat, endless plains of Kansas. The world flattened and stretched, the sky grew larger, and the few trees they saw looked lonely and defiant. Helena watched not the landscape, but the people. She watched the hard-faced men with guns on their hips, the weary women with too many children, and the slick-looking gamblers whose eyes were always moving. She felt the raw, untamed energy of the land seeping through the floorboards of the train. This was a place where the veneer of civilization was thin, easily torn. One afternoon, as the train rattled through a stretch of land that was nothing but red dirt and scrub brush, a single gunshot cracked through the air. It was sharp and close. Women screamed. Mary gasped and ducked down in her seat, her face pale. Helena didn't flinch. Her hand went instinctively to the small bag on her lap where she kept her knife. Her eyes scanned the windows, searching for the source of the shot. A few minutes later, a group of cowboys on horseback galloped past, firing their pistols into the air, whooping and hollering as they raced the train. They were drunk or just full of wild spirit, a casual display of the violence that was always simmering just beneath the surface of this land. Mary was trembling. "They could have killed someone." "They could have," Helena said, her voice calm as she gently urged her sister to sit up. "Out here, people do what they can get away with. Remember that." As they crossed into Colorado, the landscape transformed again. The red desert rose up to meet them in the form of towering mesas and jagged rock formations that looked like the ruins of some ancient, giant city. The sun was a physical weight, beating down on the carriage and baking the air until it was thin and hard to breathe. This was Elias Scott's world. It was vast, beautiful, and utterly merciless. Finally, the train's whistle shrieked, and with a great groaning of brakes and hissing of steam, they pulled into the station at Trinidad. The platform was a chaotic swirl of dust, people, and noise. Men shouted, wagon wheels creaked, and the air was thick with the smell of steam, horses, and hot, dry earth. Mary clutched Helena's arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "He said he would be here." "We'll find him," Helena said, her own gaze sweeping the crowd, assessing every man, looking for a threat. And then she saw him, or rather, she saw a man who seemed set apart from the bustling crowd. He was leaning against a wooden support pillar, his hat pulled low. He was tall and lean, dressed in clean but worn dungarees and a simple cotton shirt, even from a distance. Helena could see the stiffness in his posture, the way he held his right hand. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the disembarking passengers, his gaze intense, searching. When his eyes passed over them, they paused for a fraction of a second before moving on. He was looking for one woman, not two. Elias saw them at the same moment. He saw the flash of corn silk hair and the simple blue dress Mary wore. She matched the hopeful, timid girl from the letters. "There she is," he thought, a wave of awkward relief washing over him. He pushed himself off the pillar, his limp more pronounced as he started forward. But as he drew closer, his focus shifted. Standing just behind the pretty, blonde girl was another woman, a shadow to her light. She was taller, her expression closed and guarded. Her stormy gray eyes met his across the dusty platform, and Elias felt an unexpected jolt. Her gaze wasn't curious or hopeful. It was a surveyor's cold measure. It was an accusation. It stripped him bare in an instant, seeing past the clean shirt and the respectable rancher to the broken soldier beneath. He stopped a few feet from them, suddenly feeling clumsy and exposed. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair threaded with premature gray at the temples. "Miss Mary?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Mary blushed and gave a small curtsy. "Mr. Scott, it is a pleasure to finally meet you." Before Elias could reply, the other woman spoke. Her voice was as steady and cool as her gaze. "I am her sister, Helena. I've come with her." It was a statement, not a request. It was a line drawn in the dust. Elias stared at her, his mind struggling to process this unexpected complication. He had sent for a wife, a solution to his solitude. He had not sent for a chaperone, a guardian, a judge. The letter. It only mentioned one, he said, the words coming out blunter than he intended. Mary is not accustomed to traveling alone, Helena said, her expression unchanging. I will work for my keep. I am not afraid of hard work. Elias looked from Helena's defiant face to Mary's anxious one. He could see the plea in the younger sister's eyes. To refuse would be to send them back to whatever life they were fleeing, a life that had put this hardness in the older sister's eyes. He was a man of his word, and he had promised Mary a home. He let out a slow breath, the dust of the platform settling around his boots. My wagon's over here, he said, turning away abruptly. The ride is long. The journey to the ranch was a study in silence. Mary, caught between her formidable sister and her taciturn husband-to-be, said nothing. Helena's silence was a palpable thing, a watchful, waiting presence. Elias drove the wagon, his shoulders tight, acutely aware of the two women behind him. He had sought peace, and instead, he had invited a new kind of war into his life, a quiet, domestic one he had no idea how to fight. When they finally crested the last rise and the ranch came into view, the small house, the sturdy barn, the lonely cottonwood, he felt a surge of possessive pride and, beneath it, a current of apprehension. This was his sanctuary, the one place he was master. He pulled the wagon to a halt and got down. We're here. Mary looked at the modest house with wide, hopeful eyes. To her, it was a palace. Helena's gaze swept past the house, taking in the vast, empty landscape that surrounded them. The endless sky, the distant mountains. She was assessing the size of the cage. As Elias unloaded their single trunk, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The house had one bedroom, his bedroom. There was a small cot in the main room he sometimes used on hot nights. It was a space built for one man's solitude, not for three people's complicated lives. I'll sleep in the barn for now, he found himself saying, the words tasting like a surrender. You two can take the house. Mary started to protest, but Helena cut her off with a sharp look. That is acceptable, she said, as if she were agreeing to the terms of a treaty. That first evening was the most uncomfortable of Elias's life. He showed them the well, the woodpile, the layout of the small house. Mary tried to be helpful, her movements fluttery and uncertain. Helena moved with a quiet efficiency, her eyes missing nothing. She checked the sturdiness of the door, the latches on the windows, the contents of the pantry. She was not a guest. She was a sentinel. When Mary went to the bedroom to unpack, Helena did not leave her side. Elias found himself standing alone in the main room of his own house, feeling like an intruder. His domain had been invaded. He was used to the silence being filled with his own ghosts, his own regrets. Now, it was filled with the rustle of petticoats from the next room and the weight of a woman's condemning stare, a stare he could feel even through a closed wooden door. He had sent a letter seeking a wife of good character to bring decency and order to his life. He looked at Mary, the girl he had chosen, and saw the promise of that quiet, simple life. But his gaze, against his will, kept being drawn to her sister. He was unnerved by Helena, angered by her silent judgment. And yet, he couldn't look away. He had thought he was saving a mail-order bride from a life of poverty. He was beginning to suspect he had invited something far more dangerous into his home. He had invited a woman who looked at him not as a savior, but as the very devil she'd spent her life fighting. And the most troubling part was, he wasn't entirely sure she was wrong. The first weeks on the ranch settled into a rhythm of strained silence and unspoken duties. The vast, empty landscape that Elias had once found solace in now felt charged, each sunrise bringing a fresh awareness of the two strange women who inhabited his home. He had bartered for a wife, but he had received a puzzle he couldn't solve. Mary tried. God, she tried. She rose each morning before the sun, her movements eager but clumsy, a city bird trying to learn the ways of a hawk. She attempted to cook on the cast-iron stove that had been Elias's mother's, a squat black beast that either belched smoke or sat stubbornly cold. Her biscuits were hard as stones. Her bacon was often a sacrifice to the flames, and the coffee she brewed was a thin, bitter water that Elias choked down out of a pained sense of duty. She tried to mend his worn shirts, her delicate stitches a stark contrast to the rough, patched fabric. She would follow him to the barn, her blue eyes wide with a desire to please. But she flinched from the earthy smell of the livestock and jumped when a horse snorted too close. This wild, unforgiving land was not in her blood. The silence terrified her. Back in St. Louis, the world was a constant symphony of noise, trolley bells, vendors' calls, the hum of 1,000 lives pressed together. Here, the silence was a living thing, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the mournful howl of a coyote in the distance. At night, this fear consumed her. Elias, sleeping on his cot in the barn, would often be woken by a muffled scream from the house. He would lie there in the hay-scented darkness, his hands clenched, feeling a frustrating mix of pity and impotence. She was his intended wife, and he could not even offer her a peaceful night's sleep. Her fear was a wall between them, a constant reminder of how ill-suited she was for this life he had offered. And then there was Helena. While Mary struggled, Helena simply was. She moved through the ranch as if she had been born to it. She observed everything with her cool, gray eyes, and where she saw a need, she filled it. On the third morning, after watching Mary weep over a smoking skillet, Helena stepped into the kitchen without a word. She banked the fire in the stove with an expert hand, added coffee grounds to the pot until the brew was black and strong, and produced a pan of fluffy, golden brown cornbread from the oven as if by magic. She didn't gloat or criticize. She simply did the work that needed doing. Her competence was a quiet, constant rebuke. She learned the rhythms of the ranch with an unnerving speed. She fed the chickens, her movements calm and economical, never startling them. She learned to milk their single cow, her hands strong and steady on the teats. Elias came back from the fields one afternoon to find her in the stable, calmly brushing down his mare, murmuring to the animal in a low voice that seemed to soothe its skittish nature. One night, the baying of wolves, closer than usual, sent a fresh wave of panic through Mary. Elias grabbed his rifle and headed for the porch, expecting to see both sisters huddled inside. Instead, he found Helena already there, standing in the moonlight. She was holding his spare shotgun, the barrel resting in the crook of her arm as if it were a natural extension of her body. She wasn't trembling. Her eyes were fixed on the dark ridge where the howling originated. "They're just testing the fences," she said, her voice a low murmur in the dark. "They smell the new calf." Elias stopped in his tracks, the rifle feeling heavy and useless in his hands. He was the soldier, the man of the house, the protector. Yet here she was, standing guard over his home, his livestock, and her sister, with a composure that shamed him. In that moment, she wasn't a mail-order bride's unwanted sister. She was an equal, a warrior of a different kind. A strange and unwelcome conflict began to wage war within Elias. He looked at Mary, and he felt a deep, aching pity. She was the picture of femininity he had thought he wanted. Soft, delicate, dependent. He had a duty to protect her, to be patient with her. She was a good girl, a decent girl, trying her best in a world that was too harsh for her. He wanted to feel tenderness for her, the simple, straightforward affection a husband should have. But when he looked at Helena, he felt something else entirely. It was a sharp, dangerous current of something. Respect, certainly, but it was more than that. It was a raw, unwilling fascination. He found himself watching her as she worked, the efficient way her hands kneaded dough, the straight line of her back as she carried buckets of water from the well, the way her gaze would sweep the horizon, as if searching for an enemy he couldn't see. She never smiled, Not a real smile, but sometimes, when she looked at Mary, her expression would soften for a fleeting second, and he would see a glimpse of the fierce, protective love that drove her. She understood things without him needing to speak. She understood the language of survival. When he came in from the fields, his leg aching from the damp, she would have a cup of hot coffee waiting without him having to ask. She never commented on his limp or the tremor in his right hand. She saw his wounds. He knew, but she treated them as she treated the land, as a simple, hard fact of life, neither to be pitied nor ignored. She seemed to look straight through his skin and see the weary soldier beneath. And for the first time since the war, he felt seen without feeling judged. The first true crack in the wall between them came on a blistering afternoon in late summer. A storm was brewing in the mountains, the air thick and heavy with the promise of rain. One of his heifers, a first-time mother, had been in labor since dawn, and something was wrong. Her cries were weak and strained. Elias knew the calf was likely breached. He grabbed his kit and headed for the far pasture, a grim set to his jaw. These things happened. It was often a choice between the mother and the calf, and usually, you lost both. He was halfway there when he heard the sound of hoofbeats behind him. He turned, annoyed at the intrusion, and saw Helena riding his spare gelding, a sturdy horse he rarely let anyone else handle. She rode well, her seat balanced and confident. She pulled up alongside him, her face set. "She's been down for hours," Helena stated, not a question. "You'll need help turning it." Elias stared at her, dumbfounded. "This is no place for a woman. It's bloody work." Her gray eyes flashed with something like contempt. "I imagine I've seen worse things than blood. Mr. Scott, are you going to save that calf, or are we going to sit here and discuss etiquette?" He had no answer for that. He just grunted and spurred his horse forward, Helena keeping pace beside him. The scene at the pasture was grim. The heifer was exhausted, her sides heaving. Elias dismounted and went to work, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. It was a difficult, messy business. The calf was tangled, and he had to reach deep inside the struggling animal, his muscles straining. He had expected Helena to stay back, to hold the horses. Instead, she was right there beside him, her skirt hitched up and stained with mud. She followed his instructions without flinching, holding the heifer's head, speaking to her in that same low, calming voice she used with the horses, applying pressure where he told her to. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized, their breathing harsh in the heavy air. Finally, with one last, desperate pull, the calf came free. It was a small, slick bull calf, and for a terrifying moment, it lay still on the grass. Elias's heart sank. But then Helena was there, grabbing a handful of hay and rubbing the calf's body vigorously, clearing the fluid from its nose and mouth. A moment later, the calf gave a sputtering cough, then a weak bleat, and lifted its wobbly head. They had done it. They had saved him. Elias sank back on his heels, covered in sweat and blood, every muscle in his body aching. He looked at Helena. Her face was smudged with dirt. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and there was a streak of blood on her cheek. He had never seen anything so beautiful in his entire life. They sat there in silence for a long time, watching the heifer lick her newborn clean. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering in the dust around them. "You learned that in St. Louis?" Elias asked, his voice softer than he intended. Helena shook her head, her gaze on the calf. "You learn it when there's no one else to do the learning for you. You learn to deliver things, or you learn to bury them. The principle is the same." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He thought of the war, of the field surgeons working in bloody tents, making impossible choices. He thought of his brother, Samuel, whom he had failed to save. She was talking about more than just livestock. "I was at Antietam," he heard himself say. The words came out of nowhere, a confession he hadn't made to another living soul. The creek. It ran red. For 3 days, we didn't deliver anyone. We just buried. He expected her to look away, to offer some empty platitude. Instead, she turned her stormy eyes on him, and they were filled with a profound, weary understanding. Everyone has their own antietam. Mr. Scott, she said quietly. Some battlefields are just quieter than others. In that moment, something shifted deep inside Elias's chest. A piece of the ice that had encased his heart for years cracked. This woman, this stranger, understood the part of him that he kept hidden from the world. She didn't pity his scars. She acknowledged her own. The rain began to fall in earnest, washing the blood and dirt from their hands. But Elias felt as though it were washing something clean inside him. Too, a flicker of warmth, something he had long mistaken for dead, began to stir. The aftermath of that day was a new and delicate tension in the house. A bond had been forged between Elias and Helena in that pasture, an unspoken understanding that set them apart from Mary. Elias found his eyes following Helena more than ever, and now, when he looked at her, he felt not just fascination but a deep, resonant pull, a feeling that terrified him. Mary felt the shift immediately. She wasn't foolish. She saw the way Elias looked at her sister when he thought no one was watching. She saw the quiet conversations they had on the porch after supper, their voices too low for her to hear. She saw the easy way they worked together, a silent partnership she could never be a part of. The jealousy began as a small, bitter seed and grew into a thorny vine that wrapped around her heart. She became more clinging with Elias, demanding his attention, asking for his help with simple tasks she could have managed herself. Her nighttime fears worsened, and her tears became a weapon she used to remind him of his duty to her, the fragile girl he had promised to protect. Helena saw it all. Each night, through the thin wall separating her cot in the main room from the bedroom, she heard her sister's stifled sobs. She knew she was the cause of Mary's unhappiness. Guilt gnawed at her. She had come here to save Mary, to ensure her sister had the decent life she herself had been denied. But perhaps her presence was poisoning the very dream she had sought to protect. Yet, how could she leave? She looked at Mary's tear-stained face and at Elias's haunted eyes, and she knew neither of them could survive this place without her. She didn't trust Elias's heart. She didn't believe he was capable of the gentle, patient love her sister needed. And if she was honest with herself, a small, treacherous part of her did not want to leave him. The breaking point came on a night when the sky itself seemed to crack open. The storm they had seen brewing in the mountains descended on the plains with a biblical fury. Rain hammered against the roof so hard it sounded like a drum roll for the end of the world. Wind shrieked around the corners of the house, and thunder exploded directly overhead, shaking the very foundations. A piercing scream ripped through the noise. It was Mary. Elias, who had been sitting at the table trying to repair a piece of tack, shot to his feet. He rushed to the bedroom door and threw it open. Mary was huddled in the center of the bed, her hands over her ears, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her eyes were wide with a primal terror, unseeing. "Mary!" Elias shouted over the storm. "It's just thunder." She didn't hear him. She was lost in her own private hell. "It's coming in! The walls are falling! Don't let them get me!" she shrieked, her voice thin and reedy against the roar of the wind. Elias was frozen. He had faced down cannon fire and cavalry charges, but this was a battle for which he had no training. He didn't know what to do. He took a step toward the bed, his hands outstretched, a useless gesture. He felt a surge of frustrated anger. Why couldn't she be stronger? Just as he was about to reach for her, perhaps to shake some sense into her, a presence filled the doorway behind him. It was Helena. She pushed past him, her face a mask of calm authority. But before she went to her sister, she did something that stopped Elias's world on its axis. She reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. It was a small, simple touch, Her fingers were firm, her skin warm against his. It was not a caress. It was an order. Stop, stay back. You are no help here. But for Elias, the touch was like a lightning strike. A jolt of pure, unadulterated shock coursed through him, silencing the storm, silencing Mary's screams, silencing everything but the frantic hammering of his own heart. In that single point of contact, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. His frustration, her understanding, their shared burden, the terrible and undeniable current that flowed just beneath the surface of their lives. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. Her gray eyes met his in the flickering lamplight, and for the first time he saw not a judge or a guardian, but a woman as trapped and torn as he was. The moment stretched for an eternity, a pocket of absolute stillness in the heart of the storm. Then, she released him and turned to her sister, her brief touch leaving a brand of fire on his skin. The fragile peace forged by the storm did not last. The rain had washed the air clean, but inside the small house, the atmosphere remained thick with unspoken words and unresolved tensions. The memory of Helena's hand on his arm was a phantom heat on Elias's skin, a constant, nagging presence. He threw himself into his work with a renewed ferocity, as if he could sweat out the confusion that plagued him. He was a man who understood fences, cattle, and the clear lines of duty. He did not understand the intricate, invisible walls that had risen between the three of them. The ghost from the past arrived on a Tuesday, riding a sway-backed nag that looked as weary as the landscape. The man himself was an affront to the stark simplicity of the plains. He wore a dusty bowler hat, a waistcoat that had once been fine silk, and a smirk that didn't reach his shrewd, close-set eyes. He looked like a creature of gaslight and back alleys, swept out of the city and deposited on Elias's doorstep by a cruel joke of the wind. Elias was mending a harness near the barn when the man rode up. Mary, who had been hanging laundry, was the first to see him. She offered a hesitant greeting, her natural sweetness warring with her ingrained fear of strangers. "Good day, ma'am," the man said, tipping his hat with a flourish that was entirely out of place. "Looking for a Mr. Elias Scott. Was told he resides hereabouts." It was then that Helena came out onto the porch, a basket of mending in her hands. She froze. The basket slipped from her fingers, spilling thread and cloth onto the dusty planks. A flicker of something cold and sharp passed through her gray eyes, not fear, but the instant, calculating recognition of a predator. The man's smirk widened into a grin that showed a row of yellowed teeth. "Well, I'll be... Helena. Last I saw you, the scenery was a mite different, a lot more brick and a lot less dirt." Mary looked from the stranger to her sister, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Helena, you know this man." "We were acquainted in St. Louis," Helena said, her voice dangerously level. She came down the steps, placing herself between the man and her sister, a silent shield. "What do you want? Caleb?" "Caleb Thorne. At your service," he said, ignoring Helena and addressing Elias, who had walked over, his expression grim. "Just passing through. Imagine my surprise to find a familiar face from home, especially Helena's. She was always one for making friends, had quite a circle of admirers, if you catch my meaning." The innuendo hung in the dry air, oily and foul. Elias felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He looked at Helena's stony face, at Mary's innocent confusion, and a cold dread began to seep into his bones. This man, Caleb Thorne, was a snake, and he had just slithered into the heart of Elias's fragile world. "My wife and her sister are not accustomed to uninvited guests," Elias said, his voice flat and hard. "State your business or be on your way." Caleb chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "No need to be inhospitable. Mr. Scott just wanted to pay my respects. I'll be staying in Trinidad for a few days. Perhaps Helena and I can catch up." for old time's sake. He gave Helena one last, meaningful look, tipped his hat again, and nudged his pathetic horse back toward the main track, leaving a trail of poison in his wake. The silence he left behind was deafening. Mary was full of questions, but one look at her sister's face silenced them. Helena's expression was terrifying in its control. She picked up her fallen mending basket, her movements stiff and precise, and went back into the house without a word. For 2 days, a storm of a different kind brewed. Helena was a ghost in the house, silent and withdrawn. The air crackled with her suppressed anxiety. Elias watched her, a war raging inside him. The snake's words had planted a seed of suspicion, a seed that landed in the fertile ground of his own past trauma. He thought of his brother, Samuel, and the painted smiles of the women in the saloons, women who offered fleeting comfort for a price. He tried to push the thought away, to dismiss Caleb as a liar, but the image of Helena's frozen expression wouldn't leave him. On the 3rd evening, just as twilight bled across the sky, Elias saw her slip out of the house. She moved with a stealth that set his teeth on edge, glancing back at the windows before hurrying not toward the open plains, but toward the old, abandoned line shack at the far end of his property, a dilapidated structure he used for storing old equipment. Every instinct screamed at him. It was a secret meeting, a tryst. The snake had come back. He didn't think, he reacted. The careful control he had maintained for years snapped. The soldier took over, the man who had learned that hesitation was death. He followed her, keeping to the shadows of the outbuildings, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He reached the shack and heard the low murmur of voices from within. Helena's and a man's, Caleb's. He couldn't make out the words, only the tone. It was urgent, furtive. He crept closer to a grimy, cracked window and peered inside. In the gloom, he could see their shapes. They were standing close, too close. As he watched, Caleb reached out and put a hand on Helena's arm. It was all the proof he needed. The sight ignited the tinder of his suspicion into a raging inferno. The shame, the betrayal, the memory of his brother's wasted body, it all converged into a single, blinding point of rage. He didn't see a woman trying to protect her family. He saw the embodiment of the sickness that had destroyed his own. He didn't go to the door, he went through it. With a roar of pure, animalistic fury, he threw his shoulder against the rotting wood. The door exploded inward, ripped from its hinges, and crashed to the dirt floor in a cloud of dust and splintered timber. Helena and Caleb sprang apart. Caleb yelped in terror, scrambling back like a startled rat. But Helena just stood there, her face illuminated in a shaft of moonlight from the broken doorway. Her expression was not one of fear. It was one of utter, soul-deep humiliation. A choked, strangled cry escaped her lips, the sound of a carefully constructed world shattering into a million pieces. "Get out!" Elias snarled, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He wasn't looking at Caleb. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, were locked on Helena. Caleb didn't need to be told twice. He scurried out the broken doorway and disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps a frantic tattoo on the hard-packed earth. Now they were alone, Elias and Helena, trapped in the ruins of the shack, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. The air was thick with dust and rage. "So this is it," Elias said, his voice dripping with a venom he hadn't known he possessed. "This is the decency you bring to my house, meeting your admirers in my barn." "You don't understand," Helena whispered, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Oh, I understand perfectly," he spat, taking a step closer. The smell of her, of soap and wood smoke and woman, filled his senses, mingling with his fury until he felt dizzy. "I understand your kind. I saw enough of it in the war, in the cities. Women who smile for any man with coin in his pocket. The kind of woman who took my brother's life." Every word was a lash, and he saw her flinch with each one. But her head stayed high, her gray eyes flashing with a defiant fire of their own. You know nothing about me, Elias Scott, nothing. I know what I see. I see a woman who sneaks out in the dark. I see a woman who stands too close to a snake from a St. Louis gutter. I gave you a home. I gave your sister a chance at a clean life, and you repay me by bringing your filth to my doorstep." "My filth?" she cried, and now the tears came, hot and furious, cutting trails through the dust on her cheeks. "You think this is about filth? You, with your high and mighty talk of decency. What do you know of what it takes to survive? What do you know of choices that aren't choices at all?" Her voice broke on a sob, a raw, ragged sound of a soul torn open. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once, leaving behind an unbearable weight of shame and exhaustion. Her shoulders slumped, her strong, straight back, the one he had admired from afar, finally bowed. She took a staggering step back and her heel caught on the broken door. She fell. In a heartbeat, the rage in Elias vanished, doused by a wave of something else, something terrifying and overwhelming. He saw her not as a deceiver, but as a falling woman. He moved without thinking, his soldier's instincts taking over, and caught her before she hit the ground. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against his chest. She was trembling violently, her body racked with sobs. She felt impossibly fragile in his arms, a broken bird. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, the scent of her overwhelming him. The hard lines of his anger melted away, replaced by a profound, aching confusion. He was holding the object of his fury, and all he felt was a desperate urge to protect her from the very words he had just used to destroy her. She wept against his chest for a long time, a storm of grief and shame that had been held back for years. And then, in a voice so low he had to strain to hear it over the sound of his own heart, she began to speak. "I was 16, she whispered, her words muffled against his shirt. "Our parents were gone. The winter was so cold, and Mary was sick. She was coughing, and she was so thin. There was no food, no money for a doctor. There was nothing." He felt the words more than he heard them, a vibration of pure misery that traveled from her body into his. "There was a man, the landlord. He had food, he had medicine, and he looked at me. He said he would forgive the rent. He said he would bring a doctor for Mary. All I had to do was be kind to him." Elias closed his eyes, a sharp pain lancing through his chest. He held her tighter. "I did it to save her," Helena choked out. "I went to his room, and I saved her, but I lost myself that night, and after that, it was the only thing I had left to sell. It was the only way to keep her safe, to keep her fed, to keep her innocent. I built a wall around her with my own shame. Every meal she ate, every clean dress she wore, was bought and paid for. In rooms like that one, with men like him." The confession poured out of her, a torrent of ugliness and sacrifice. She told him about Caleb, a man who had managed one of the houses she worked in, a man who knew all her secrets. He had found her by chance in Trinidad and had threatened to tell Elias everything unless she paid him to keep silent. The meeting in the shack was not a tryst. It was a desperate negotiation to protect the new life she was trying to build for her sister. Elias listened, and the world he had built for himself, his entire rigid code of honor and decency, crumbled into dust. He had stood on his self-righteous ground, forged in the clean fire of battle, and judged her. He, who had killed men and watched them die, had dared to call her life filth. He looked down at the woman in his arms, and he saw not a fallen woman, but a soldier who had fought a war far uglier and lonelier than his own, without a uniform or a flag to hide behind. She had fought for a single cause, her sister, and she had won. She had delivered Mary to his doorstep, pure and untouched by the world that had tried to crush them. The weight of his own blindness, his own arrogant judgment, fell on him like a mountain. He had written a letter to save a mail-order bride, to bring a respectable woman into his life. He had spent weeks pitying Mary for her fragility, while all along, the strongest, most honorable person he had ever met had been sleeping under his roof, silently guarding them all. I saved the wrong one. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't that he wished Mary harm. It was the devastating realization that his pity, his sense of duty, had been directed at the survivor, not the sacrifice. He had been so focused on saving the gentle dove that he had failed to see the lioness who had been protecting her all along. Meanwhile, in the house, the sound of the crashing door had jolted Mary from a light, uneasy sleep. She had sat up in bed, her heart pounding. Then she heard the shouting, Elias's voice, raised in a fury she had never heard before, and Helena's, sharp with pain. Terrified, she had crept from her bed and tiptoed to the front door, cracking it open just enough to see. She saw the light of a lantern in the old shack and heard the faint, angry voices. Then she saw a man, the stranger, Caleb, flee into the darkness, overcome with a terrible curiosity. She slipped out of the house, her bare feet silent on the cool earth, and crept toward the ruined shack. She huddled in the shadows outside the broken doorway, just in time to hear her sister's broken, whispered confession. Every word was a nail driven into Mary's heart. The landlord, the sickness, the food she had eaten, the dresses she had worn, the entire architecture of her innocence, an innocence Helena had so fiercely protected, collapsed around her. She saw her life for what it was, a gift purchased at an unimaginable cost. Her jealousy, her petty tears over Elias's divided attention, all of it seemed so childish, so monstrously selfish in the face of her sister's sacrifice. She saw Elias holding Helena, not in anger, but in a desperate, protective embrace, and in that moment, Mary understood everything. She understood the bond between them, a bond forged in a crucible of pain and survival that she could never comprehend. She understood that Elias didn't just respect her sister. He saw her, and perhaps he loved her, the way a man should love a woman, not with pity, but with a soul-deep recognition. She had come here to be saved, but Helena was the one who deserved salvation. Tears streamed down Mary's face, but they were not tears of self-pity. They were tears of shame, of gratitude, and of a love for her sister so fierce it stole her breath. She backed away from the shack, a new and terrible clarity in her mind. She was the ghost at this feast. She was the reason for Helena's shadows. She went back to the house, her movements no longer hesitant or clumsy, but filled with a sudden, resolute purpose. She lit a lamp, found a piece of paper and a pencil, and with a steady hand, she wrote. Then, she packed a small bag with a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and her warmest shawl. She looked around the small, safe house that had been her dream, and then she walked out into the night, not as a frightened girl, but as a woman making her own sacrifice. Back in the barn, the storm of emotion had passed, leaving a fragile, exhausted quiet. Elias gently led Helena to a stack of old hay bales, and they sat, not touching, but connected by the charged space between them. Finally, Helena lifted her head. The tears were gone, replaced by her old, familiar resolve. But now it was tempered with a deep weariness. "I have to find her," she said, her voice raspy. "Mary, she can't be alone." She started to get up, her duty as a protector reasserting itself. "Helena, wait," Elias said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I can't wait. She's my sister. It's what I've always done. I have to go to her." She turned to leave, to chase after the one constant in her life. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. She stopped but didn't turn around. "I can't." And then Elias did something he had not done since he was a boy, pleading with his mother. He slid off the hay bale and knelt in the dirt and dust at her feet. The proud soldier, the solitary rancher, the man who had built his life on a foundation of unbending pride, knelt before her. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers closing around hers. "Please," he whispered to her back, his voice breaking. "Don't leave. Stay. With me." Dawn broke, cold and gray, over a world remade. Elias's plea still hung in the dusty air of the old shack, a sound more vulnerable than any cry of pain he had uttered on the battlefield. Helena stood frozen, his hand clasped around hers, the impossible weight of his kneeling form anchoring her to the spot. For her entire life, she had been the one who stood, who fought, who never bent. To see this proud, broken man on his knees for her was a disorienting shock, a shift in the very foundations of her world. But Mary was out there, alone. The instinct to protect her sister was a force of nature within Helena, a river that had carved the channel of her life. "I have to find her," she repeated, her voice a raw whisper. She gently pulled her hand from his. "Get up, Elias. We have to find her." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a desperate fear she had never seen there before. It was the fear of being left alone again. He slowly, stiffly, rose to his feet, the spell broken, replaced by the grim urgency of their task. They found Mary's note on the kitchen table, a single sheet of paper weighted down by a salt cellar. Her handwriting, usually so delicate and looping, was firm and clear. "If you love her, then do not let her live in the shadows anymore. I will be fine. I need to find my own light." Mary. The words were a final, selfless blessing and a clear-eyed condemnation of the life they had been living. Elias read it, and the last vestiges of his guilt solidified into a hard, cold resolve. He had failed one sister through his blindness. He would not fail the other through his inaction. "She'll have headed for the mountains," he said, his voice clipped and professional, the voice of a soldier planning a campaign. "It's the only way a person on foot would think to go, to follow the high ground. She'll think it's safer." He knew it was the opposite. The high country was a treacherous maze of canyons, false trails, and sudden, violent weather. It was no place for a girl who was afraid of thunder. They moved with a speed born of shared purpose. Helena, a whirlwind of efficiency in the house, packed saddlebags with dried beef, hardtack, a bottle of whiskey for medicine, and all the spare blankets she could find. Elias, his movements precise and economical, readied the 2 best horses, checking their shoes and cinching the saddles with an expert's touch. They didn't speak of what had happened in the shack. They didn't speak of the note. Their communication was in the silent, fluid way they worked around each other, 2 parts of a single machine driven by one goal: find Mary. They rode out as the sun cleared the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the plains. They rode north, toward the jagged blue line of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that loomed like a fortress wall against the sky. The land grew rougher with every mile, the flat prairie giving way to rolling foothills cut by deep arroyos. The air grew thinner, colder. Elias was a master of this terrain. He read the signs in the bent grass and the displaced stones, his eyes constantly scanning, searching for the small, scuffed tracks of a city dweller's shoes. Helena rode beside him, her own gaze sweeping the landscape. She was not a tracker, but she had a survivor's instinct. She watched the flight of birds, the places where rockfall looked recent, the dark mouths of caves that might offer shelter. For the first day, they rode in near silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady clop of their horses' hooves. The silence was not the strained, uncomfortable quiet of the ranch house. It was a working silence, a silence of concentration and shared understanding. In the shared ordeal of their search, a new kind of intimacy was being forged, one built not on whispered confessions, but on the solid ground of mutual reliance. He was no longer just a man, and she no longer just a woman. They were partners in a desperate quest. As dusk fell, they made a cold camp in a small, sheltered canyon. Elias started a small, smokeless fire, while Helena portioned out their meager rations. They sat on opposite sides of the flames, the firelight dancing on their weary faces. "He thought he could hurt you," Elias said suddenly, his voice low. He was staring into the fire, but he was seeing the face of Caleb Thorne. "That man, he thought your past was a weapon he could use against you." Helena looked up, surprised by the sudden breach of their unspoken truce. "To men like him, it is," she said, her voice devoid of self-pity. "It's a brand, a mark of shame." "He was wrong," Elias said, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers. His eyes were clear and fierce in the firelight. "It's not a brand, it's a shield, the one you carry to protect her." Her breath caught in her throat. He had taken the ugliest part of her life, the secret she had guarded with every fiber of her being, and he had reframed it not as a source of shame, but as a source of honor. It was a gift of understanding so profound that it left her speechless. She could only nod, a tight, grateful motion, before looking back into the flames, her heart aching with an emotion that was too new and too powerful to name. They started again at first light. The trail grew steeper, the path a mere suggestion of a track clinging to the side of the mountain. They had to dismount and lead the horses, the animals skittish and nervous as loose shale clattered into the canyons below. The sky, which had been a brilliant, clear blue, began to curdle, turning a bruised, ominous gray. The wind picked up, howling through the rock formations with a mournful, human sound. "A storm's coming," Elias said, his eyes on the churning clouds. "A bad one. We need to find shelter. Now!" They were exposed on the mountainside, vulnerable to the wind and the lightning that was beginning to flicker between the peaks. Just as the first icy pellets of sleet began to fall, Helena spotted it, a dark slash in the rock face 100 yards above them, the entrance to a shallow cave. It was a desperate scramble to reach it, the wind tearing at them, the sleet stinging their faces. They managed to push the horses into the relative shelter of an overhang at the mouth of the cave before stumbling inside themselves, soaked to the bone and shivering. The cave was not deep, just a hollow carved out of the mountain by centuries of wind and water. But it was shelter. It was enough. They huddled together in the back, away from the driving sleet, listening to the storm rage outside. The temperature had plummeted. The cold was a physical thing, a predator that gnawed at them, seeping through their wet clothes and into their bones. Elias worked quickly, using his knife to shave tinder dry splinters from a piece of deadwood he'd found in the cave. His hands, however, were shaking violently. The old tremor in his right hand had returned with a vengeance, and his left leg was locked in a rigid, painful cramp. "The damp gets in the old wounds," he muttered, his teeth chattering. He tried to strike a match, but his shaking fingers couldn't manage it. "Here," Helena said, her voice firm. She took the match from him. Her own hands were steady. She struck it on a dry rock, and a small, precious flame bloomed in the darkness. She carefully nursed it to life, feeding it the wood shavings until a small, courageous fire was blazing between them. The warmth was a blessing. But as Elias huddled closer to the flames, a more violent shiver racked his body. A feverish, unhealthy flush was creeping up his neck. The physical exertion, the icy soaking, and the raw emotional toll of the last few days had conspired against him. The ghosts of Shiloh and Antietam had risen up to claim their due. Within an hour, he was delirious. He lay on a bed of saddle blankets, his eyes glazed over, muttering disconnected phrases from a life she knew nothing about. He called out names: Samuel, Captain Miller, and gave orders to men who had been dead for a decade. He was no longer the stoic rancher. He was a young, terrified soldier, reliving the horrors of the war in the flickering firelight of the cave. Helena became a warrior once more. She shed her own exhaustion like a heavy coat and went to work. She stripped off his wet shirt and covered him with every blanket they had. She melted sleet in their small cookpot and forced sips of lukewarm water between his cracked lips. She took the whiskey, not to drink, but to soak a strip of cloth from her petticoat and bathe his burning forehead. She tended to him through the long, howling night, a lone sentinel in a sea of darkness. The storm outside was a mirror of the one raging inside him. She listened to his fevered ramblings, piecing together the fragments of his pain. She heard the guilt over his brother, the horror of the battlefield, the deep, abiding loneliness that he had tried to bury under acres of land. She was seeing the raw, unguarded soul of the man, and her heart broke for him. Sometime near dawn, the fever seemed to reach its peak. He thrashed on the blankets, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body rigid with some remembered agony. "No, no, hold the line! Don't let them break!" he cried out, his hands clenching at the empty air. "Hush, Elias," she murmured, leaning over him, her voice a low, soothing balm. "It's over. The fighting is over. You're safe." She smoothed the damp hair back from his forehead. Her touch seemed to calm him slightly. His thrashing subsided, and he sank back into a restless, mumbling sleep. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, red light on his face. The lines of pain and hardship were smoothed away in his unconsciousness, and she saw the face of a younger man, one who might have known how to smile. An overwhelming wave of tenderness washed over her, a feeling so powerful and so long suppressed that it brought tears to her eyes. This man, who had infuriated her, who had judged her, who had shattered her defenses and then knelt at her feet, she was inextricably bound to him. Her life, which for so long had had only one purpose, one direction, now had a second. Believing he was lost to the world, adrift on his sea of fever dreams, she gave in to a momentary impulse. She leaned down, her own face just inches from his. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She hesitated for a heart-stopping second. Then gently, tentatively, she pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound compassion, a kiss of farewell to the lonely woman she had been and a quiet hello to the one she was becoming. It was a touch as light as a moth's wing, a secret she meant to keep forever. She pulled back, her heart hammering against her ribs. His eyes were still closed. He let out a soft, shuddering breath, and then his lips formed a single word, a hoarse, broken whisper that cut through the sound of the wind. "Helena!" It was not a cry of delirium. It was a sigh of recognition. It was the sound of a man finding his anchor in a storm. The sound of her own name on his lips broke her. The carefully constructed dam of her control, the wall she had spent a lifetime building, crumbled into dust. He had felt her. He had known her. Even in the depths of his fever, his soul had reached for hers. A sob escaped her, a raw, wrenching sound. She pressed her fist to her mouth, but the tears came, unstoppable. They were not the tears of shame she had shed in the barn, or the tears of anger she had shed in her life. They were tears of a devastating, terrifying, beautiful release, in a cold, dark cave on the side of a mountain, with a dying fire and a feverish man. Helena finally allowed herself to feel loved. The fever broke with the dawn. The storm passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and silent. Elias woke, weak and disoriented, to the taste of strong, hot coffee and the sight of Helena sitting by the fire, her expression calm but her eyes red-rimmed. He remembered the fever only in flashes, a nightmarish collage of battle and pain, but he remembered a single point of light in the darkness, a gentle touch, a soft pressure on his lips, and a name, his voice whispering a name. Neither of them spoke of it. They didn't need to. Something had passed between them in the cave, something as irrevocable as the sunrise. They found Mary 2 days later. A landslide, triggered by the storm, had completely blocked the mountain pass. A small way station, a couple of crude cabins that served as a rest stop for prospectors and trappers, was on the other side, completely cut off. And there, sitting on the porch of one of the cabins, was Mary. She was safe, having been taken in by the gruff but kind old trapper who ran the place. But the girl who ran to meet them was not the same one who had fled into the night, her time alone, her forced self-reliance in the face of a real, tangible danger, had burned away the last of her childish fears. Her eyes were clearer, her back straighter. She hugged Helena with a fierce, clinging strength, but there was no hysteria in it, only relief. The journey back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was a thoughtful, contemplative silence. Mary rode between them, no longer a fragile piece of cargo to be protected, but a third traveler on a shared road. That evening, they sat together in the main room of the house. The fire crackled in the hearth, a comforting, domestic sound. The air of crisis had passed, leaving behind the need for a final, painful reckoning. Elias knew what he had to do. He turned to Mary, his face etched with a deep, weary guilt. "Mary," he began, his voice low and hoarse, "I need to apologize. I brought you here under false pretenses. I offered you a life, a home, and I failed you. I was a blind, arrogant fool. My feelings, they became confused. What happened between me and your sister?" He trailed off, unable to find the words to explain the complex, powerful thing that had grown between them. But Mary stopped him. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of quiet strength that was eerily reminiscent of her sister's. She was smiling, a sad but genuine smile. "You didn't fail me, Elias," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You saved me. You brought me out of a life that was no life at all, and I will always be grateful for that." She looked from him to Helena, her gaze clear and full of a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "I listened. That night at the shack," she confessed quietly. "I heard everything, and I understood. I was never in love with you, Elias. I was in love with the idea of being rescued. I saw you as a way out. I never saw you." She took a deep breath. "I was never loved," she continued, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I was only ever saved, first by Helena, then by you, and now I want to choose for myself. I want to find a love that I choose, not one that I need just to survive." She looked at her sister, her eyes shining within fierce, unconditional love. "You deserve to be seen, Helena. You deserve to step out of the shadows, my shadows." Elias and Helena could only stare at her, silenced by the simple, profound grace of her words. She had released them both. She had given them her blessing. Later, after Mary had gone to bed, Elias and Helena sat before the dying fire. The secrets were all out now, laid bare. There was nothing left to hide behind. The silence stretched, but it was no longer a space of tension or uncertainty. It was a space of possibility, a blank page. They were three people, broken in their own ways, their lives impossibly, inextricably tangled. Nothing was simple, nothing was clear, but as they sat there in the quiet warmth of the house, surrounded by the vast, silent plains, they were no longer just three lonely souls. They were a strange, scarred, and unconventional constellation. They were together, and for the first time in a long, long time, they were safe. The peace that settled over the ranch was a fragile, breathing thing. It was a peace born not of simplicity, but of a shared, complicated truth. The roles in the house had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Mary, no longer a frightened girl playing the part of a wife, moved with a new, quiet confidence. She found a simple joy in the daily rhythms of the homestead, her hands growing capable, her spirit growing calm. She was no longer running from a past, but building a present. Elias and Helena moved around each other with a gravitational pull that was both powerful and unspoken. The memory of the cave, of fever and confession and a single, secret kiss, was a live current between them, A glance across the dinner table could hold a novel's worth of meaning. A brush of hands as they passed in the narrow hallway could send a jolt through them both. There was a deep, resonant tenderness, but also a careful restraint, as if they were standing on the edge of a cliff, both terrified and thrilled by the prospect of the fall. They were three people in one house, a strange and delicate ecosystem, finding a way to grow in the cracks of a broken world. But the world outside the borders of their ranch was not so understanding. Whispers, like tumbleweeds, travel fast on the open plains, and the story of the reclusive rancher, Elias Scott, and his two women had become the favored gossip in Trinidad. It started with Caleb Thorne, who, before leaving town, had spread a poisoned version of the truth, painting Helena as a cunning temptress and Elias as a fool. The tale grew with each telling, twisted by the bored and the self-righteous into something monstrous and unnatural. The first sign of the coming storm came during a routine trip to town for supplies. As Elias helped the sisters down from the wagon, a hush fell over the main street. Storekeepers who had always offered a gruff but polite nod now stared at their boots. Women, gathered in front of the mercantile, stopped their chatter and followed them with narrowed, judgmental eyes. The air was thick with it. Condemnation. Mary, who had once been terrified of strangers, now lifted her chin and met their stares with a cool dignity that surprised Elias. But Helena's face became a familiar, impenetrable mask. She had felt this kind of scrutiny before, the silent judgment of a world that reduced a woman's worth to a single, narrow definition. She walked with her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead, but Elias could feel the tension coiled in her like a spring. He loaded their supplies with a grim, simmering anger. He was a man who had sought only to be left alone, to live a quiet, decent life. He had brought these women into his home, and in doing so, had inadvertently placed them in a pillory for the entire town to gawk at. The confrontation came a week later. They appeared on the horizon as a dark smudge of dust, which slowly resolved into a procession of 4 wagons. It was not a mob with torches and pitchforks. It was something far more insidious. It was a delegation of decency. At its head was Silas Gable, the town blacksmith, a barrel-chested man with a thick beard and a belief that his physical strength gave his opinions the weight of divine law. Beside him sat his wife, a thin-lipped woman who was the primary engine of the town's gossip mill. Behind them were other prominent townsfolk, a merchant, a few ranchers with their wives, all wearing expressions of grim, pious duty. Elias saw them coming from the porch. He felt the old, cold calm of the battlefield settle over him. He sent the women inside, not to hide them, but to meet this threat on his own terms. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, his feet planted, his hands loose at his sides, and waited. Gable brought his wagon to a halt and climbed down, his face a mask of stern solemnity. "Scott," he said, his voice booming across the yard, "we've come as neighbors, as concerned, God-fearing folk." "You've come a long way to be concerned, Gable," Elias replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "We have," Gable affirmed, puffing out his chest. "There are things a town cannot abide. It's an affront to the laws of God and man. You have 2 women living in your house, unmarried. It is an unnatural arrangement. It sets a poor example. It breeds filth." The word hung in the air, the same word Elias had once thrown at Helena. He felt a hot flash of shame, immediately followed by a chilling rage. "My house is my own," Elias said, his voice like flint. "What happens under my roof is my business." "Not when it spills out and poisons the community," a woman called from one of the wagons. "We are a decent town." "So you've come to enforce this decency?" Elias asked, a humorless smile touching his lips. "What is it you want? Do you want me to cast one of them out? Send them back to whatever life they fled? Is that your Christian charity, Gable?" "We want you to restore order," Gable thundered, his face turning red. Marry the one you're supposed to, and send the other one on her way. It's the only proper thing to do." At that moment, the door of the house opened. Helena and Mary stepped out onto the porch. They stood side by side, their faces pale but resolute. They were not going to let him face this alone. Seeing them, Gable's face hardened. "You see, brazen. They have no shame." That was the line. Elias took a slow step forward, and the easy stillness of his posture transformed into something predatory. The delegation shifted uneasily. They had come to lecture a lonely rancher. They found themselves facing a wolf. He walked past Gable and stood before the wagons, his gaze sweeping over every face in the crowd. He let the silence stretch, forcing them to meet his cold, blue eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with the clear, deadly authority of a man who had commanded troops in the face of death. "I'm going to tell you all something," he began, his voice low and even. "I spent 4 years of my life in a war. I saw things that would turn your pious stomachs. I killed men. I killed them for a cause I was told was justice, for a flag I was told was righteous." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I learned what is worth fighting for and what is worth dying for. And it is not a flag. And it is not some preacher's definition of order." He turned and gestured toward the 2 women standing on his porch, their hands now clasped together. "Those 2 women," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that stunned the crowd into silence, "are more honorable, more decent, and have more courage in them than this entire town put together. They are my family. They are under my protection. Today, if I have to raise a rifle to protect the ones I love, I will." The threat was unmistakable. It was not the hot-headed boast of an angry man. It was a calm, measured promise from a soldier who knew precisely how to keep it. The self-righteous certainty on the faces of the delegation faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. They were blacksmiths and merchants, not soldiers. They had come to bully a sinner, not to face down a killer. Silas Gable stared at Elias, his mouth slightly agape. He saw not a rancher, but a ghost from the war, a man who had been to hell and was not afraid to go back, without another word. Gable turned, climbed back into his wagon, and led his procession of decency in a dusty, ignominious retreat. The immediate threat had passed, but a dark cloud now hung over them. They had not made friends. They had made enemies. The retaliation came 3 nights later. It was a moonless, starless night, the kind of oppressive darkness that swallows sound. They were woken by a frantic, desperate shouting from the direction of their nearest neighbor, the Henderson place, a small homestead a mile down the creek. Elias was the first one out the door, rifle in hand. A terrifying, demonic red glow was pulsing against the night sky. The Hendersons' barn was on fire. He didn't have to think. "Helena, stay with Mary! Lock the door!" he yelled, already sprinting for the stable. He saddled his mare in a record time, his mind racing. It was arson, a message, a punishment. When he galloped into the Henderson yard, the scene was one of chaos. The barn was a roaring inferno, the flames leaping 100 feet into the sky. Henderson and his oldest son were frantically trying to release the terrified livestock from the corral, their faces illuminated by the hellish light. Henderson's wife was on her knees in the yard, screaming, "My baby! Sarah, she's still in the house!" Elias's blood ran cold. He looked at the farmhouse. The fire had not yet reached it, but thick, black smoke was pouring from the windows of the loft where the children slept. Henderson and his son were trapped on the other side of the roaring barn, trying to save their livelihood. They hadn't even realized the danger to the house. Just as Elias was about to charge toward the farmhouse, a second rider galloped into the yard, a figure of impossible grace and fury. It was Helena. She had disobeyed him. She had followed him. She took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The burning barn, the screaming mother, the smoking house. She didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for a man to give an order. While Elias was still processing the horror, She had already leaped from her horse and was sprinting toward the farmhouse porch. "Helena, no!" Elias roared, but his voice was lost in the crackle of the flames. She disappeared into the smoke-filled house. Each second that passed was an eternity for Elias. He was frozen, trapped between the fire and the house, his duty divided. He saw Henderson finally realize what was happening and start running toward the house, his face a mask of agony. And then, the front door burst open. Helena stumbled out, her hair singed, her face black with soot. In her arms, she carried a small, coughing bundle. The Hendersons' 5-year-old daughter, Sarah. She thrust the child into the arms of her weeping mother and then collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her body racked with violent coughs. At that moment, with a great groan, the loft of the farmhouse, where the child's bed had been, erupted in a gout of flame, and the roof caved in. The fire burned itself out by dawn, leaving behind the blackened, skeletal remains of the Hendersons' barn and home. But the story of that night was already spreading faster than the flames had. Several riders from town, including Silas Gable, had come to help fight the blaze. They had all seen it. They had seen the woman they had called shameless, the woman they had tried to drive out, run into a burning building to save a child's life while the men were saving horses. They stood there in the gray, smoky light of morning, their faces smudged with soot and shame. Mrs. Henderson would not let go of Helena's hand, her face a mess of tears and gratitude as she tended to the burns on Helena's arms. The town's view didn't just shift, it shattered. The whispers of condemnation were replaced by awed murmurs of heroism. A few days later, another visitor came to the ranch. This time it was a single rider, an old man in the black coat of a minister. It was Reverend Miller, a man who had served as a chaplain in the Union Army. He was old and stooped, but his eyes were as clear and sharp as a young man's. Elias met him on the porch, his posture wary. The Reverend dismounted, his movements stiff with age. "I was a soldier once, too, son," the old man said, his voice raspy. "At Gettysburg, I know what it is to see the world burn, and I know what it is to try and build a home from the ashes." He looked past Elias, into the house where Helena was resting, her arms bandaged. "I heard what you said to Gable's delegation, and I heard what that woman did at the Henderson fire. It seems to me that honor is not always found in the places we expect." He placed a wrinkled hand on Elias's shoulder. "The world breaks everyone. Son, afterward. Some are strong at the broken places. God's law is love. All the rest is just commentary. You have built a home here. Mr. Scott, a strange one, perhaps, but there is love in it, and there is strength. May God bless it." He didn't stay long. He simply offered his quiet blessing and rode away, leaving behind a sense of peace, of acceptance from a world they thought had rejected them entirely. That evening, the three of them sat together in the main room. The ordeal was over. The external war had been won. Helena's arms were healing, but the event had forged the final, unbreakable link in the chain that bound them. It was Mary who finally gave voice to the truth that had been living silently between them. "I don't want to leave," she said softly, looking at the fire. "Either of you. This is the only real home I have ever known, the only real family." She looked at Elias, then at her sister. "I propose," she said, her voice gaining a strength she had never possessed before, "that we stay, all of us, together, not as a husband and his wife's sister, but as a family. No one has to choose. No one has to be left behind." Elias looked at Helena. Her gray eyes, no longer guarded, were full of a deep, trusting warmth. In them, he saw his future. He saw his peace. He saw his home. He had spent his life believing that decency was a rigid, narrow path, but he had learned that it was a wide and compassionate embrace. He simply nodded. It was all the answer they needed. Later that night, they were in the kitchen, preparing a simple supper. The room was warm and filled with the smell of simmering stew and fresh-baked bread. The lamplight cast a soft, golden glow. There were no words. None were necessary. Helena stood by the stove, stirring the pot. Elias came and stood beside her, and his hand found hers, their fingers lacing together naturally, easily. On the other side of the room, Mary was slicing bread. She paused and watched them for a moment, a gentle, happy smile on her face. Then she walked over to her sister and, leaning in, rested her head on Helena's shoulder. 3 people, a soldier, a savior, and a survivor. 3 broken hearts, scarred and battered by the world. Now standing together in the warm light of their kitchen. They were whole. They were home. Hey Viet Tiep, fan 6 inches kua kau chu yen bang tieng and theodani dagi no dai koang 3000, 3502, tralai ket kwacho toichi gom noi dung kwa fan neva kong gom gikak. 10 kak nan va trong chu yen pai la kak kai 10 thuong ko onuak min hung nam 1850 to 1900. Neu ko tungu hai noi dung kwan hai kam voi chin sach kwa ban di ban hai they the no ban kak tungu kak nenang hon makong la mat the yining ye kua kau chu yen. Hai tralai ket kwacho toi luon trong hop toi chat nei. Kong su dong hop toi canvas. O kwoi hei viet mot kau kam on kan gia dang ye kau chuyen va kyu goi kan gia bint luan sem ho dang ye kau chuyen neo dao de kung giao lu. Moi ho dang ki ken from Wild West vachia se sui ni kwa min bang tieng an. Sao dai la fan dan yi kan viet fan 6. Kuok song tai trang trai on din tro lai. Nung hin an doi thuong de kam suk. Ban guoi lam ruong. Nao nuong. Sua hang rao. Kuoing gua. Elias say them mot gian na noi voi fong chin. De kong I bi bo lai pia sao. Helena de Mary catch ban sung. Mary de Helena catch me valai chiek ve ko tung mak ngai den de. Nong kan lang man nong nan gua Elias va Helena. An sang lua. Doi ban te run re. Nong kat kau bidon nen va roy bung chai. Kan rieng gua Elias va mari kung diu dang kong kem. Sung gain gung. Nung kung dai shuk dong. Cho they tin yu kong chila dam me makon la chua lan. Helena dung goe kua. Nin kwaki sang. Nuok mat roy nung lavihan puch. Ko kong konso biu nua. Ket truyen. Kaba dung truok mot man dat moi. Chuan bitrong hoa oai huang debat dao mua shuan dao tien nu mot gia din thuk su. Show thinking autumn painted the high plains in shades of gold and rust, and a new kind of quiet settled over the ranch. It was no longer the silence of solitude or the silence of tension, but the deep, contented silence of a home that has found its rhythm. The days fell into a pattern of shared work, a choreography of 3 bodies moving in unspoken harmony. They became a common sight, a trinity against the vast landscape. Elias, his limp less pronounced now, his shoulders no longer held in a rigid line of defense, would work the fields. And often Helena would be there with him, her strength a match for his own. They would mend fences together, their hands often brushing as they passed wire and tools, a simple touch that spoke volumes. Mary, who had once been afraid of the vastness, now found her own domain. She tended a burgeoning vegetable garden with a fierce pride. Her hands, once soft and useless, now skilled and dusted with rich soil. She brought life from the unforgiving earth, and in doing so, found her own. Their evenings were spent in the warm glow of the lamp, the house filled with the smell of Mary's surprisingly excellent stews and Helena's perfect bread. They would talk, not of the past, but of the present, of the coming winter, of a sick calf, of the price of grain in Trinidad. They were small conversations, the simple currency of a shared life, but to them, they were precious. Sometimes, Elias would watch them. Mary mending a shirt with her newfound skill, Helena reading from a tattered book by the firelight, and a feeling of such profound peace would wash over him that it felt like a physical warmth in his chest. He had sought decency and order, and he had found something far richer, belonging. One morning, Elias stood outside the house, staring at its simple, rectangular shape. It was a structure built for one man's loneliness. It was not enough. The cot in the main room where Helena slept, the single bedroom shared by the sisters, it was a temporary arrangement, a solution born of crisis. He wanted something permanent. Without announcing his plan, he began to work. He hitched the wagon and made the long trip to a lumber mill in the foothills, returning with a load of fresh-cut pine that smelled of the deep forest. He laid a new foundation of stone next to the main room, a square of earth that connected directly to the existing house. The sisters watched him, curious. "What are you building, Elias?" Mary asked, her hands on her hips. Elias stopped, leaning on his shovel, and looked at the two of them. "An addition," he said simply. He looked at Helena, and then at Mary, and his next words were the truest vow he had ever made. "So that no one gets left behind." The building of the new room became a shared project. It was a physical manifestation of the family they were forging. Elias, with his soldier's precision, cut and measured the wood. Helena, surprisingly strong, helped him raise the frame, her movements sure and steady. Mary, with her eye for comfort, planned the interior, chinking the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and grass, ensuring it would be warm against the winter winds. The sound of his hammer became the new heartbeat of the ranch, a steady, rhythmic promise of a future built by their own hands. He cut a new doorway directly from the main living space, so the new room was not an afterthought, but an integral part of the home. It was a room for Helena, a room of her own, connected to them all. As the house grew, so did the bonds between the sisters. Their old roles, that of the fierce protector and the fragile protected, began to blur and merge. One afternoon, Helena took Mary out to the far pasture, a rifle in her hands. "You need to learn," Helena said, her voice serious. "This land, it's not always gentle. You need to be able to protect yourself, to protect this home." Mary, who once flinched at the sound of a horse's snort, looked at the heavy weapon with apprehension, but she saw the earnestness in her sister's eyes, and she nodded. Helena's instruction was patient and methodical. She showed Mary how to stand, how to breathe, how to hold the rifle so its kick wouldn't break her shoulder. She showed her how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking. When Mary finally hit the tin can they had set on a fence post, a triumphant smile lit up her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated pride. In that moment, she was not the girl who had been saved. She was a woman of the West, capable and strong. In return, Mary undertook a different kind of instruction. One evening, she brought out the simple, blue dress she had worn on the day they arrived. It was frayed at the cuffs and the hem was torn from her flight into the mountains. "It's time we'd mended this," Mary said softly, laying it across Helena's lap. She brought out her sewing basket. "You gave me a life where I could wear a pretty dress. Let me show you how to care for one." Helena, whose hands knew the heft of a gun and the strain of a plow, was clumsy with the delicate needle and thread. Her fingers, strong and capable, fumbled with the tiny stitches. But Mary was a patient teacher. She guided her sister's hand, her touch gentle, showing her how to make the stitches small and even, how to turn a ragged tear into a neat, almost invisible seam. As they sat there, their heads bent together in the lamplight, they were not just mending a piece of cloth, they were mending the last torn places in their own story, stitching their past to their present with threads of shared love and newfound skills. The nights grew colder, and the fire in the hearth became the center of their world, the physical restraint between Elias and Helena, a necessary shield in the early days of their new arrangement, began to feel like an unbearable weight. The longing between them was a palpable thing, a low hum beneath the surface of every conversation, every shared glance. One night, after Mary had retired to her room, a comfortable silence fell between them. They sat before the fire, the flames painting their faces in flickering shades of orange and red. The wind howled outside, a lonely sound that only served to amplify the warmth and intimacy of the small room. Elias looked at Helena. Her face, which he had once thought hard and unforgiving, was softened by the firelight. He saw the strength there. Yes, but he also saw the deep well of vulnerability she had fought so hard to hide. He saw the woman who had charged into a burning house, and the woman who had wept in his arms. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently touched a lock of hair that had fallen across her cheek. The touch was electric. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his hand, her gray eyes closing for a brief second. "Helena," he whispered, his voice thick with a desire that had been suppressed for months. She opened her eyes, and in their stormy depths, he saw not a hint of fear, only a reflection of his own desperate need. The world shrank to the space between them, to the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of their own hearts. The time for restraint was over. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not like the chaste, compassionate kiss in the cave. This was a kiss of fire and hunger, of months of unspoken words and repressed emotion finally breaking free. It was a kiss of desperation and discovery, a claiming. Her lips parted under his, and she met his passion with an intensity that stole his breath. Her hands came up to cup his face, her fingers tracing the scars he had carried for so long, not as marks of damage, but as the map of the man she had come to love. His arms went around her, pulling her from her chair and into his lap, holding her as if he feared she might vanish if he let go. The kiss deepened, becoming a raw, soulful communication that transcended words. It spoke of shared pain, of mutual respect, of a love that had grown in the harshest of soils and had not only survived, but triumphed. This was not the furtive, shameful coupling of a back-alley room from her past. This was a sacred, shattering communion in the heart of their home, witnessed only by the fire and the storm. It was the release of every lonely night, every silent fear, every moment of hopeless yearning. For Elias, it was the end of his war, a final, unconditional surrender to a peace he never thought he'd find. For Helena, it was the discovery that a man's touch could be a thing of reverence, a touch that did not take, but gave, a touch that healed. But the love in that house was not a single, narrow flame. It was a fire with many hearths. The bond between Elias and Mary settled into a different, but no less profound, kind of tenderness. She was the sister of his heart, the first crack of light that had entered his dark world. He felt a deep, protective affection for her, a quiet gratitude that was a constant, gentle presence between them. He would often find her in her garden, her face smudged with dirt, and he would bring her a cool cup of water from the well. They would stand there, talking quietly about the coming frost or the stubbornness of weeds. There was an easy comfort between them now, the shyness replaced by the familiarity of family. One evening, he found her on the porch, staring up at the vast, star-dusted sky. He came and sat beside her, following her gaze. "It's not so scary anymore," she said softly, without looking at him. "The quiet, the bigness of it all. It used to feel like it was trying to swallow me. Now, it just feels like home." "You made it a home, Mary," he said, his voice full of a sincere, gentle respect. "You brought the light back into this house." She finally turned to him, her sweet face illuminated by the moonlight. "No," she said, her smile soft and full of wisdom. "Helena brought the strength. You brought the safety. I just planted the flowers." He reached out and, with a hesitation that was born of pure reverence, he gently took her hand. It was not a gesture of passion, but of deep, familial love, a promise. He was her protector, her brother, her friend, and in the quiet holding of her hand, there was a healing of its own kind, a mending of the original, broken promise he had made in his letter, transforming it into something truer and more lasting. From the new doorway of her room, Helena watched them. She saw the gentle way Elias held her sister's hand. She saw the peaceful, contented smile on Mary's face. A few months ago, The sight would have sent a spear of jealousy through her heart. Now, it filled her with a warmth so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She leaned against the doorframe, a silent, unseen witness to this quiet moment of love. The tears that traced their way down her cheeks were not tears of sorrow or sacrifice. They were tears of pure, unadulterated happiness. Her two people, the two halves of her own heart, were safe. They were loved. She had fought her whole life to give her sister a home, and in the process, she had found one for herself. She was no longer just a protector, standing guard against the world. She was a part of that home, a part of that love. She finally understood that she did not have to be afraid of being loved. She only had to be brave enough to accept it. The last snows of winter melted, and the creek began to run high and fast. The air softened, carrying the sweet, earthy smell of the thaw. Spring had come to the high plains. One morning, the three of them stood together before a patch of earth near the house, a piece of ground that got the best of the morning sun. Elias had tilled it the day before, turning the dark, rich soil in his hands. He held a small sack. "What is it?" Mary asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. Elias looked at Helena, a slow, warm smile spreading across his face. He reached into the sack and pulled out a handful of tiny, dried seeds. "Reverend Miller brought them," he said, "from his wife's garden." He opened his palm. "Lavender," Helena whispered, a sound of pure wonder in her voice. The scent, faint and floral, rose to meet them. They worked together, the three of them, on their knees in the warm spring sun. They pressed the seeds into the earth, one by one. They were not just planting flowers. They were planting their future. They were planting peace and devotion and a quiet, fragrant serenity. They were starting their first spring as a family, a strange and beautiful garden grown from the most unlikely of seeds, in the most unforgiving of soils. Three broken souls, standing together under the vast western sky, their hands in the dirt. Finally, truly, home. Thank you for listening to this story, wherever you are in the world. Tuning in. I hope it brought a piece of the Old West to you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to hear from you. Please consider subscribing to the channel From Wild West and share your thoughts on the journey of Elias, Helena, and Mary.